I wanted to just sort of start off by introducing myself and doing a couple quick thank yous. Try to make this as close to a real opening as we possibly can, whatever that looks like now. And then we'll go over just a couple quick details about the tour overall. So really quick, my name is Jane Christensen. I'm the curator of exhibitions here at the Utah Museum of Contemporary Art. I'd like to first start out by thanking our sponsors. So I'd like to thank ZAP, Zoo Arts and Parks, for funding a lot of what we do at the museum. I'd like to thank the George S. and Dolores Dore Eccles Foundation. And I'd also like to thank Diane and Sam Stewart Foundation for all of their support. Along with that, I'd like to thank Jane for being sort of the guinea pig in this and agreeing to take the challenge on of being our first virtual opening. I'd also like to thank Zach Norman, who is our marketing communications person, who has really stepped up to figure out how to make this work for us so we can make this an option at the museum for at least right now. We'll see if it continues on. And then finally, thank you to everybody who's in the room right now. I can't really see how many there are because I'm on my phone, but thanks to everybody for coming out to support Jane in this and and to support the museum. So really quick, just about details. Jane's going to talk about the work as I walk around, so I'm going to do my best to hold the camera as steady as I possibly can. So we're thinking the tour will probably be 20 to 30 minutes, just depending on how things go for this. And then Jane's agreed to do a Q&A after the fact. So knowing that there's potential to be, I think, 86 people in this Zoom meeting, what we'd actually like to do is have you use the chat function. So if you have a question for Jane, why don't you go ahead and type it, and she'll be able to see it on her screen, and she can go through and answer those questions as we go along. So yes, so now I would like to introduce Jane Christensen, our former artist in residence, and I'll let her do her thing. So thanks again. Thanks, Jane.
Thanks, Jared. Thanks so much for everyone who's been a part of this, and just for logging on tonight. It means a lot to me. So this is my exhibition, Mapping It Out. So as you enter the gallery, there are a combination of works on the wall, kind of more dimensional works coming off the wall versus more flat works. These two pieces definitely fall into that more kind of sculptural category, where my painting started to shift a little bit more 3D. But Jared, if you don't mind, I think I want to move along to the next works. So this grouping over here, this whole show really started when I was looking through photos that I took between traveling back home to New York and traveling around Utah. And just kind of like this feeling of trying to locate myself, trying to orient myself, and the relationship I have with these places. So with that said, I think these paintings were definitely kind of abstractions of more figurative work, more literal landscapes. So like the squares that you see that are often repeated with these kind of 2 by 2 foot paintings, I was really interested in the idea of like sampling places, taking like fragments of places and kind of collaging them together to make a greater whole. And the photo next to it, it's really small, but I really like this idea that like these places that are literal places I've been to are also kind of glitching and becoming a lot more abstract through memory and through the way that I remember them. I think it's a very universal feeling to have places that you feel really connected to, but maybe when you go back to them, the reality is much different from how you remember it. So that's definitely a theme with the work in the show as well. And I think also pairing these smaller works that, in this case, the photograph's a lot more literal, and it starts to kind of wander away. I think there's something really interesting about creating this relationship where this more literal, more articulated place is juxtaposed with something that is a lot more abstract, yet has like a certain physicality that the other doesn't. So that's something that definitely was on my mind. And then I think the next kind of two groupings are a little bit similar. This time though, my dimension started to grow out from that dimensional painting to more of a sculpture with that shelf next to the painting. And these I'm super excited about. This is definitely something that I started playing with more toward the end of my residency at the museum. So this idea of landscape, breaking down the image that is a landscape, thinking about the way that we digest landscapes visually. So kind of drawing a parallel between a horizon line and a shelf, or just like that simple horizontal line that's created with these very simple objects just placed along that as well. So I think there's definitely an element of play in this too. That's also really important to me as part of my process. So there are those. And as we move along, so we have the squares that are repeated. In my wall text, which is a part of the show, which you can easily find on the info page online where you maybe saw the virtual tour, I talk a little bit about an inspiration to me, which is Rosalind Krauss's writing on grids. So she at one point talks about grids kind of having this way of mapping reality, kind of making fiction become nonfiction, become something very tangible. And a favorite passage from that is that grids have a mythic power in that they make us able to think that we are dealing with materialism or sometimes science or logic, while at the same time, grids provide us with release into belief or illusion or fiction. So again, kind of playing with this idea of maybe like memory of a place, or maybe landscape as a means of escape versus an actual location, an actual environment that we exist in. So the grid is important to me in that it does provide this structure that my work kind of goes back to as certain elements kind of start to scatter and grow more and more abstract. That definitely provides this sense of like geometric structure that I'm interested in. And again, these smaller three works on the right side are kind of playing around with each other. Maybe some of them look a little bit like flowers. Maybe some of them look a little bit like leaves. Just kind of, they start to blend, the forms start to blend a bit. So just things that I'm playing around with in my process as I work, as I paint. And then the next piece over to the left, again, these kind of stacked squares, again, referencing grid, also referencing samples that you might find as as you're constructing a space. And then definitely this one gets more depictive with these playful kind of flower and leaf forms that I started messing around. So I was just thinking, I spent a few years really getting into photography after focusing mostly on painting. And I think I got really tired of how flat photography can be. And so I think me spending more time on painting kind of allowed me to get back into kind of the physicality of paint, building up paint a bit more, and then also these forms on top of the painting are some paper mache forms that I was playing with as well. So just this overall idea of collaging and kind of like collaging a landscape together, or trying to slap something a little bit haphazardly together to create a more legitimate image is something that's really interesting to me, and that I continue playing with in this work. So, and then next over here, this one's really nice. I think it's a nice break, a bit of a quieter moment from maybe the other groupings that feel maybe a little bit more crowded or maybe a little bit more connected. These definitely are still connected with similar shapes and forms repeated. Again, those squares that are repeated. But I was just kind of thinking about also like how I could reiterate some of these ideas, and maybe approach some of the same ideas in a different way. So definitely this is an example of kind of like the painting being the more 2D thing on the wall. And then as you get closer, it definitely, you can see those kind of circles on top of it are kind of popping out a bit, creating more dimension. So I'm also interested in this idea of like flattening space versus expanding space, and kind of like that disorientation that you might feel. And so I'm excited about this grouping because we have these objects next to this little stacked shelf, which is super fun, with similar repeated forms. So I just think, again, just kind of playing with those ideas of expanding and contracting. And then, of course, I have some of those blue kind of boulders on the floor, which I think are super fun. They're really fun to play with and make and experiment with. Again, just kind of challenging myself. How could I think of painting a little bit more dimensionally, challenging myself to create something a little bit more sculptural, a little more separated from wall-bound painting. And then just a little bit further down. Oh, I guess, Jared, I just realized we have that cute little grouping behind you. So these are really great. I love kind of like the personality too that some of these kind of turned out to have. A lot of this work was just really new to me, and I think the residency was a wonderful time for me to experiment. So I'd never really worked with making sculpture in like that kind of sense before. So again, I was just kind of thinking about similar ideas to my more two-dimensional work, kind of breaking down an image, breaking down form, reducing it a bit while also still pulling color, playing with relationships with shapes, and then space between them. So just kind of like creating a little landscape, while also having these like images around the whole gallery that are also kind of riffing on landscapes or places that are important to me. So a lot of this work I feel like is maybe like a therapeutic way for me to feel like I have control over where I am, or um, like a way for me to reflect on places I've been and to orient myself in a way that feels comfortable or even just like fun for a minute. So I think these are just another playful experiment with that. Um, and then continuing on, I have another little grouping over here. So I definitely make work like individually, like I make a painting and maybe I make a sculpture and then maybe I make um, something more floor bound. But I do think the element of relationships and installation is really important to me, because I do want these individual pieces to also be somewhat dependent on each other, in the sense that they kind of like inform one another when they're in proximity to each other. So with that said, this section, I definitely was more reflective on those like desert landscapes that I've been in and spent a lot more time in since being in Utah full time. So this piece, this is kind of like a desert floor sample. So on the back panel, I have this like super fine, like little dotted detail of just different like color. It's a little bit more textural. And then on top of that, kind of superimposed, it's like as though I'm like zooming in on that. So in a lot of my photographic work, before this, I was kind of playing around with like collaging different landscapes together to make an entirely new place. So I think this is like maybe a more simplified form of that, where I'm just starting to focus on like two different viewpoints maybe and imposing those on one another. Yeah, and having fun with abstraction of landscape too. And then below this, I have some boulders as well, which I also think are like pretty humorous too, considering their scale. So I think also it's just like, what would it be like if we could just like pick these monumental things up and kind of rearrange them and have fun with them. And then over on the other side, I have this floor piece, which kind of started out more as a painting. Again, I was stacking those square panels on top of each other, painting them. Again, thinking about the idea of samples and the creation of a space in a really simplified form. And then on top of them, I have these really playful kind of terracotta figures. Again, just thinking about creating really basic forms, how they can interact with each other and create a greater whole. But at the same time, the scale of these is so small that it's like a microcosm of maybe a bigger thing, or maybe like a model for a bigger place. Another way of thinking about it. And then lastly, there is this little combination on the back wall. So I have another one of these horizon line shelves with these kind of like shifting pieces of wood. And then again, with these playful figures on top of them. Most of them are unpainted. Some of them just have like a really like half done job of being painted. So kind of like the idea that this thing is still coming together, like there's this sense of evolution maybe. And then next to this, I have another photo. So I just had 2 smaller photos in this show. And then I was just again thinking about this idea of samples. So as I was making these photographic works, and a lot of my photographic work recently is very much related to the way I've been thinking about my painting, thinking about sample and just reducing images to more abstract forms. So I was just kind of color picking, playing around with finding like how many different colors I could find in what would seem like a pretty simple, pretty monochromatic image. But there's actually a lot of color in there, and just kind of playfully scattering some of them and then over to the side kind of playing around with this more systematic structure as well. So anyways, I hope you have enjoyed some of this walkthrough. This is definitely a new way of experiencing art for all of us. And I do think, I don't know, like I installed this show right before everything shut down. And I definitely have always kind of had this underlying thought of escapism and kind of reconciling my relationship with like where I am physically. And I think the last few months, Jared and I were talking about this the other day, like we've all kind of had to deal with these thoughts in our own way, just as our world is changing and as our personal environments are changing. So yeah, just things to think about, I guess. But I'm super interested in hearing any questions or answering any questions if I can, if you want to include them in the chat. I'm here for it.
Yeah, and I'm just going to jump in really quick and sort
Yeah.
of reiterate something that you just said there. We installed this show in early March, actually right as we were shutting the museum down to the public. And, it was one thing to see all of the work together and to think about these ideas of grids and sampling and combining places together and sort of taking pieces and constructing these environments in an attempt to maybe create a place that was comforting in some way. Am I still there?
Your video just kind of...
Okay, I'm sorry about that. I accidentally, here's the hiccup, and it was on my end. Sorry about that.
It's okay.
I've been able to come into the museum just a couple times since we shut down, and when I came in maybe a week ago to look at everything, it had shifted for me, and it in a way it became a show about desire, desire in terms of how the meaning has shifted right now, because everyone is meant to be spending time inside, and these are sort of desirable locations, even if they are manufactured locations. And it got me thinking a lot about, the differences in experiences in people in a city versus in Utah, where we still have the ability to kind of maintain social distance and be out in nature, versus a place like New York, where the shutdown is much more strict. And so the show, it shifted for me in that moment, being able to see it again, and to hear you go through and make and talk about it, all of that stuff, everything feels really relevant to me. And what I appreciated about the work prior to this was that you used the residency as a chance for experimentation, and to sort of work through some ideas and allow the work to, I mean, it's a finished product, but I think the ideas are still being developed, and that you were willing to allow them to exist in that way, and to use the residency in a way to just sort of experiment and be creative.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thank you, and thanks so much for just working with me and the residency opportunity. I will say, back to that experimentation, I feel like, I definitely was in a point where in my work where I feel like some things I kind of was like too comfortable with, to the point where, like, in my photos, for example, I was just starting to get really bored with like the flatness of everything. So yeah, I really enjoyed this time to be able to play more around with materials and just kind of be able to challenge myself a bit more. And in the residency too, you get to meet so many people who really help encourage you to experiment more. Let's see, any questions? I'm trying to sort through. Let's see. So someone, thanks all for your comments. I'm just trying to sift through them as best I can. And if you have any more questions, feel free to message them. So it looks like Emma Hunter just asked a question about materials, and selecting materials. That's a great question, especially since I feel like this was a time for me to really embrace new ways of working, like Jared was saying. So I really did use this opportunity. For a long time, I feel like I was like thinking, oh, I've always wanted to try paper mache, which is such a kind of like juvenile thing. I think a lot of people associate it with just really childlike. But with that said, like, I am thinking about a way of really kind of creating these landscapes in maybe a playful and childlike way. And so I just use this as an excuse to just do things that, like, for some reason I never did. And I think it's really empowering once you just decide to do something and go for it. So I definitely was playing a lot with sculptural work, paper mache. I did a little bit with clay, but again, like, I wasn't too choosy about like getting the nicest things. I was like, well, it would be fun to experiment with this, so maybe I'll just get air dry clay. So I think that too, like, depending on like, if you're interested in art and what you're doing, I think it's just important sometimes to just try stuff, even if you've never done it before, because for me, at least in this experience, it really was so transformative and really helped catapult some of my ideas in a way that I was really happy with. And then let's see. So another question I just saw, Carrie asked, which medium do you start with and how do you choose your specific locations? So I mentioned a bit earlier, I spent a lot of time in painting. That's mostly what I did when I was in my undergrad. That's kind of like my first love with art. And then I went into photo a bit. And I feel like once I got into photo, that's when I realized like I'm really interested in landscape. So I think, how do I choose my specific locations? I really just feel like it's an intuitive thing. Like a lot of locations I think about are places that I just have like a personal connection to, whether it's places in New York that I grew up going to and just loving, and like feeling a sense of solitude. And then here, I think it's the same thing. Like a lot of times, like maybe I don't feel super comfortable here, but when I go out into the desert and kind of experience this new landscape, there's something kind of comforting to me about that, or maybe like a sense of discovery. And then it looks like Laura asked, can you talk about displacement and the way place informs your work? So yeah, kind of going off of that, I think as someone who's like spent most of my life in a big city, and I had family back there even after I moved here, kind of like going back and forth even after I had moved was like very jarring to me. It was very psychologically jarring, and I think that informs my work in the sense that maybe I'm like creating these strange or surreal or very abstract like metaphors for places, or like models for places. And then also in my more kind of depictive work, like even in my photos, certainly just that act of like collaging things together to try and hold an image together, to try and make something feel feasible, or feel real. I feel like that's definitely connected to my relationship with places and an environment. So, yeah.
Jane?
Yeah, I don't know who's
Hang on,
talking.
this is David. Anyway, this saved us a road trip, and for you to be able
Oh, my family. Hi.
to go through the desert and all that there was to see as you make a road trip when you've come to visit us.
Yeah, I think I can kind of hear you in and out, but my sweet grandparents were talking about all the road trips I've made to them in Southern California. So yeah, there is definitely just a very personal connection with this work, and with just squaring up all of these different locations, and also like the physical movement from place to place. So Jared, I don't know if we maybe have time for one or two more questions. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that should be fine. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Madison, my question is, can you talk about how you decide to represent different landscapes and why certain mediums you use to connect with specific landscapes? That's a good question. Yeah, that's interesting. I feel like if I think about the more photographic pieces, and there are only two of them in the show, they are the two places that I feel most like protective over, and maybe like I don't really want to mess with them as much, even though they definitely are abstracted still and have those like superimposed squares over them. So I wonder, like, it might just be kind of a more subconscious thing that I kind of leave certain things a little bit more alone. And then with other things, I definitely feel like other pieces I kind of mess with more if maybe I have like less of a connection to, or like feel less familiar with, like maybe I'm kind of choosing to abstract certain pieces more, maybe paint them in a really reduced manner. If for me personally, their meaning is still kind of coming together as well. So maybe there's like a bit of mirroring for me with that. And then Sia, I want to get this question. How do you think this quarantine experience has shaped how you think about your work and has shaped about what you think to create next? Are you finding yourself going back to basics while at home, or are you feeling more experimental than ever? Or maybe it hasn't changed at all. That's a good question. I definitely feel like the quarantine has, I hope, forced us all to kind of slow down our thoughts and maybe reflect a bit more. I know for me, that's definitely been a positive in this experience. Just like doing some serious self-reflection, like what do I really want to do, like now, and just feel more present. So yeah, I mean, I'm still figuring that out, and maybe some of that feels like a little too vulnerable to share over this. But yes, it definitely has impacted me in a really meaningful way. And then, am I going back to basics? Yes. So I am separated from most of my art supplies at the current moment at home. So I've honestly just been spending a lot of time like drawing, which is nice. There are definitely times where I'm like craving my paints or craving to do something a little bit more dimensional, but I think it's really healthy to just kind of take a little bit of a break from that, and go back to basics. So yeah, I don't know, Jared, I think that's good. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. I think that does it. Just wanted to again say thanks to everybody for participating tonight and playing along with us, and thanks, Jane, for taking the time. Yeah, we're going to do another one of these next week for another artist that we have up right now. Her name is Devin Harkleroad. It'll be again on Tuesday night at 7:00, and hope to see some of you come back to that. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.